Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaskar. In this lecture, lecture number 4, we would be discussing some of the responses within positivism that belong to classical social science. Within social science, we are trying to engage with three classical thinkers and their bodies, theoretical bodies in sociology, namely Emile Durkheim, Karl Marx and Max Weber. While engaging with their theoretical bodies, we would be very specifically dealing with that part of their theoretical discussion which have relation with the with methodology, which offers us methodological insights, that part of their theoretical discussions which aid in arriving at an understanding of what kind of way of seeing they employed in their respective works. So, to begin with, we discuss Emile Durkheim, who derived great deal from the founding figures such as Saint Simon and Auguste Comte, as well as from some of the less discussed thinkers from France and Germany. Throughout Durkheim's sociology, including the classics such as the division of labor, the elementary forms of religious life, and even suicide, which is about applying the rules of sociological method and arriving at typologies. In all these works, one can read Durkheim's moral concern, a morally driven sociologist trying to understand moral structure of society, continuing with that spirit of positivism in which the concern was to help in the reconstruction of society. And what is the extent of positivism in Emile Durkheim's sociology? To understand that extent of positivism in Durkheimian sociology, it is important to follow the rules of sociological method that Emile Durkheim wrote. And in that book, it is very clear that a positivist sociology, according to Emile Durkheim, would be following the rules. The rules to do what? To see, to interpret, understand and explain what Durkheim calls social facts as things. The rules, they are important rules. Why? Because they will lead us to understand social facts as things. Things, what is the significance of this word things? We will get to understand a little while later. Any student of sociology knows about social fact and its three characteristics that render it as a detached, self-sufficient and general thing. The point is how one really gets to such a thing. Since the imagined distinction, since the imagined destination is a thing, the voyagers, the travelers have to train themselves to become a thing too, and that is where lies catch. To get to the things, the seeker of that thing has to become a thing as well, and to become so, one has to get rid of notions vulgaires or pre-notions against which Francis Bacon waged a battle, calling them idols of mind in philosophical discussion. Durkheim does not seem to disagree with Francis Bacon, as he says, and I quote, "It is these idola which, resembling ghost-like creatures, distort the true appearance of things, but which we nevertheless mistake for the things themselves. It is because this imagined world offers no resistance that the mind, feeling completely unchecked, gives rein to limitless ambitions, believing it possible to construct, or rather reconstruct, the world through its own power and according to its own wishes." Quote ends. As we can see, Durkheim is on a methodological struggle against idols of mind, informed by Francis Baconian proposition that if you want to be scientific in your outlook, one has to get rid of those idols of mind. Durkheim finds support from Comte and Spencer, Locke and Condillac in the methodological fight against the phantom presuppositions of mind. So, the main enemy for the positivist sociology of Emile Durkheim is this phantom of mind, against which it has to fight, a sociologist has to fight, and the victory of sociologist over this phantom of mind would eventually lead to an understanding of social reality, social fact as a thing. This is not so easy, as a sustained disciplining is prerequisite. Toward the act of discarding all the preconceptions, Durkheim invokes Descartes' method of doubt that can enable to think like thing. However, Durkheim's present is in his own words. What makes emancipation from such notions peculiarly difficult in sociology is that sentiment so often intervenes. Durkheim says this, and I quote, "We enthuse over political and religious beliefs and moral practices very differently from what we do over the objects of the physical world. Consequently, this emotional quality is transmitted to the ways in which we conceive and explain our beliefs. Feeling is an object for scientific study, not the criterion of scientific truth." Quote closes. This is, however, to be accomplished through a way of seeing that, as a consequence or precondition, distinguishes the sociologists from the rest. To begin with, the sociologists must define the things as objectively as possible by dwelling upon sense perceptions, observable data, rather than a priori conceptions. One can see how Durkheim is informed by the Enlightenment, rationalism, empiricism, and so on and so forth. But he also says that sense perception, experience can be subjective. Sense perception, experiences inferred in a very empirical mode of analysis can be very subjective. Science thus expects us to be rid of observable data too personal to us. Some of those observable data very personal to us, we are required to get rid of them. And likewise, when the sociologist undertakes to investigate any order of social facts, he must strive to consider them from a viewpoint where they present themselves in isolation from their individual manifestations. While this disciplining is important and resonant with the predecessors from 18th century, there is another side of Durkheim's discussion on the rules, which falls back on the founding figures of sociology. This is expressed in a methodological methodologically responsible way, it is presented. Durkheim tries to entrust sociologists with some kind of responsibility, and he notes, and I quote, "The principal purpose of any science of life, whether individual or social, is in the end to define and explain the normal state and distinguish it from the abnormal." Quote ends. This play with normal and abnormal is very significant here. And the role of anybody doing science or social science is to stick to that normal state where society is in good shape, contribute to that normal state. And this part of the rules creates the possibility for the sociologists to be moral agents of an imagined ideal world. In the previous lecture, I tried highlighting that everything is eventuating into the making of an extraordinary creature called intellectual, an extraordinary category of experience which will matter most in scientific epistemology, and here it comes in Durkheim as well, as he tries to create a moral agent out of a sociologist. One should hence also think, as Anthony Giddens did, that Durkheim was not primarily concerned with the problem of order, but with the problem of the changing nature of order in the context of a definite conception of social development. And it is with this regard, it is with regard to this tendency that Durkheim sets three rules to be observed while interpreting and analyzing social facts. Number one, a social fact is normal for a given social type, viewed at a given phase of its development when it occurs in the average society of that species, considered at the corresponding phase of its evolution. The word average society is to be paid attention to, along with the categories such as normal, social type. Number two, rule number two while observing social fact is the results of the preceding method can be verified by demonstrating that the general character of the phenomenon is related to the general conditions of collective life in the social type under consideration. So, the addition is collective life, addition is verification. Rule number three, this verification is necessary when this fact relates to a social species which has not yet gone through its complete evolution. Three rules. It is evident that Durkheim's way of seeing is preconditioned by the material that is being seen. He agreed with his teacher Emile Bottrops that a discipline may be called science if it has a definite field to explore. Things and reality rather than mere ideas constitutes this field. These things play important role in determining the way one should approach, see and fathom them. After setting the rules, Durkheim embarks on an interesting discussion about crime, deviance and pathology in a society. To mark out that such seemingly abnormal characteristics could be reflective of social normal, while excessiveness could be pathological, crime could be normal if it occurs in the average society. And as if a precious nugget of wisdom, Durkheim would remark, and I quote, "Nothing is good indefinitely and without limits." Quote ends. Thereby, he reveals that even in the apparently scientific readings of the phenomenon, there is this side that is fraught with certain assumptions, though of philosophical sophistication, but assumptions. He would discuss a classical example of Socrates, who was tried under the Athenian law. However, the independence of thought, which was Socrates' crime, was useful for the whole humanity as well as his country. The crime and punishment in the case of Socrates paved the way for the new morality and a new faith. Such examples are frequent in the human history, and hence one gets to see that heretics anticipated the liberal philosophy in a way. After determining the normal and abnormal of social facts of a given species, Durkheim emphasizes the need to do classification of the species, the morphology of society, that constitutes a major part of his works. It leads toward the most important and last act in the performance of being sociological. While morphology with details about the normal and abnormal of social facts are fine, they are not all about explaining any social phenomenon. And with the discussion on the Explanatory Act, Durkheim almost comes full circle on what is aspired way of seeing in sociology. What is typical of Explanatory Act in Durkheim's way of seeing? In his own words, and I quote, "When one undertakes to explain a social phenomenon, the efficient cause which produced it and the function it fulfills must be investigated separately." I repeat, when one undertakes to explain a social phenomenon, the efficient cause which produced it and the function it fulfills must be investigated separately. Here, function does not stand for goal or end, nor does it allude to intention. Intention is too subjective, and goal end connotes the idea of usefulness, simple, hence not work. Simple utilitarian logic will not work, and it is not worth consideration in Durkheimian way of seeing. Function of a social fact is the correspondence between it and the general needs of the social organism. While exploration of cause could still belong to the very basic kind of scientific investigation, Durkheim's notion of function turns out to be a sociological mysticism at work, some kind of sociological mysticism at work, amounting to what has been known as sociologism. Sociologism is making sociology over and above everything, letting sociology play larger than life role. So, this kind of idea of function creates a Durkheimian version of sociologism. This was indeed to carry forward the unfinished task Saint Simon had set toward founding the new Christianity, quote unquote, which propels Durkheim to develop a science of morality for modern industrial society, engaging with the Kantian question of categorical imperative. While doing so, he is mindful of the significance of the numerals as well as a lucid descriptive prose, and the combination of number and narration renders his work into rich readings. Even in a work like Suicide, where he plays with statistical figures to come up with a tangible idea of average, quote unquote, in determining the typologies. He is not divorced, in spite of that engagement with statistics, he is not divorced from the moralistic narration, and this is most outstanding in his work titled The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, which is safe to say by and large based on discussing symbols as manifestation of collective sentiments and collective representation. I have tried giving a very cursory kind of, very hasty kind of cruise through Durkheimian sociology. It's otherwise very vast, and it can be all summed up by saying that Durkheim presents a curiously unique version of positivism as his way of seeing in the functionalist sociology. There appears quantitative and qualitative analysis as an integrated whole without any disjunct between positivism and interpretative sociology. In this way of seeing, in this version of, in Durkheimian version of positivism, this kind of uncanny coming together of positivism and interpretation is witnessed. This is evidently a perfect implementation of positive philosophy in sociology that executes scientific epistemology of past to offer the positive possibility of society in present and future. This much, if this is what comes from Durkheim, we turn to Karl Marx and we find that Marx too, like the founders of positivism in sociology, grappled with the negative orientation of the Enlightenment. Before outlining the Marxian way of seeing, it is worth a quick reflection on close, uneasy, contentious relationship between Marxism and sociology. The closeness is due to the similarity in the contours of classical positivistic sociology as envisaged by Saint-Simon, Auguste Comte, and before them the predecessors. It is about a positive reconstruction of the social with the aid of a new science. Marxism expresses the similar concern, though the epistemological position differs from many sociologists, and the objectives and plan of action in Marxism is geared toward a more active struggle toward transformation. This closeness, due to proximity in nature and scope, agenda and action plan, makes it necessary for sociologists to place Marx as one of the important thinkers, and his way of seeing thus occupies central role amongst sociologists and social anthropologists. But then, on the other hand, there is unease between sociological and Marxist way of seeing due to the variant historical conditions behind the two. Even though Marxism is a full body of theory, it shows little sympathy for the conservative bedrock that is crucial in sociology by and large. What could be largely superstructure, epiphenomenal in Marxism happens to be inevitable important in rest of the sociology. Many of the targets against which political Marxism wages a struggle are considered necessary components of a dynamic society in sociological scheme of seeing. This paradoxical relation between sociology and Marxism, notwithstanding, becomes a rich premise for sociologists to devise a sociological Marxian body of thought, as it were. This peculiarity shall be always recalled and be tacitly present in the discussion that is going to follow now. Having noted the unease, it is desirable not to seek to show a direct correlation between Marxian way of seeing and positivism, though there are arguments in favor as well as against such a possible correlation. First and foremost is to understand the Marxian way of seeing that holds significance in sociology, and then briefly possibly return to check the merit of this correlation between Marxism and positivism. To begin with, Marx hails the revolutionary spirit of the 18th century, calling it, under quote, universal ferment into which the powers of the past are swept. It was a revolution beside which the French Revolution was child's play, a world struggle beside which the struggle of Diadochi appear insignificant, quote ends. The word Diadochi in this quote, literally meaning residue, is a term used in chemistry to refer to the residuum left after distillation. In historical sense, however, the term Diadochi also refers to the rivaling Greek successors of Alexander the Great. Some of those rivaling Greek successors were taking claim in the Greek Empire post Alexander, and Marx is referring to Diadochi. He uses the word for actors of the French Revolution. This is a usage loaded with suggestion that the real revolution was in the realm of pure thought and that had effects carried out in the form of the French Revolution, he is evidently referring to the Enlightenment to complement its philosophical fermentation. He is congratulating the philosophical churning that happened in the wake of the Enlightenment movement. However, like any such fermentation, this too met with a status quo which seized the growth. In Marx's words, and I quote, "The industrialists of philosophy," he suddenly calls them industrialists of philosophy, "the industrialists of philosophy who till then had lived on the exploitation of the absolute spirit, now seized upon the new combinations. Each with all possible zeal set about retailing his apportioned share. This was bound to give rise to competition, which, to start with, was carried on in moderately civil and staid fashion." Quote ends. This certainly deteriorated, that can be explained in the language of economics as spurious production, adulteration of raw materials, fictitious purchase, bill jobbing and bad credit system, etc., etc. These are the words Marx uses. The competition of philosophers turned bitter in the German context that characterized, according to Marx, parochial narrowness of this whole young Hegelian movement. This after effect of the grand philosophical revolution indulged in mystification, alleged mystification due to an undue dependence on Hegel. Hence, any claim to advance from Hegel was nothing more than a relapse to metaphysics and morality. This is also to be fathomed in this context of Marx and Marx's intellectual biography, which gives sufficient evidence that he read not only Hegel and other philosophers to come up with his criticism of conservatism, but also aspired to postulate universal ideas. His praise for universalism and Enlightenment heritage was expressed quite early in a letter that he wrote to his father, saying, and I quote from that letter, "History calls those greatest men who ennobled themselves by working for the universal." Quote ends. He is known to have delved deeper in Hegelian philosophy after finding Kant and Fichte unsatisfactory for his thesis, and there is a strong suggestion that Marx also engages with Saint Simon's notion of socialism. His criticism of the German young Hegelians in general and Feuerbach in particular begins to take a shape in his doctoral dissertation that was a comparative reading of the philosophies of Democritus and Epicurus, the Greek philosophers. About the same time, when everybody seems to have become Feuerbachians, Marx chides Ludwig Feuerbach, Bruno Bauer and Max Stirner, who dwelt on the basic categories of man, criticism and ego. As he puts, the young Hegelian ideologists, in spite of their allegedly world-shattering phrases, are the staunchest conservatives. These are the words of Karl Marx against conservatives. Though this is not suggestive of a total breakdown between Marx and conservatism. Conservatism and Marx had something to share with. The word conservative is italicized, to be italicized in our discussion to suggest a dual departure that Marx sets for his epistemological reasoning. One, as already indicated, is departure from the after effects, residues of the otherwise promising revolution of thoughts under the Enlightenment. Second is meant to distance Marxian scheme from the conservative as well as romantic inclinations that had sought to shift the focus from intellect to nature and social. For Marx, social is to be reoccupied without falling prey to pure thoughts of the Enlightenment or to the mystified notions of the social that stem from the romantic and conservatives. And an apt justification with the spirit of dialectic is expressed by Engels, as he puts in the preface to Capital Volume 1, and I quote, "Every new aspect of a science involves a revolution in the technical terms of that science. This is best shown by chemistry, where the whole terminology is radically changed about once in 20 years, and where you will hardly find a single organic compound that has not gone through a whole series of different names." Quote ends. Hence, it is an imperative in proposing newly developed historical framework to depart from the old terminologies and thereof connotations. Marx seeks to show the relation of the German thought with German reality, or the lack of such relation. He thus invites to rethink man. Marxian imagination of man is indeed a curious case that reveals his negotiation and departure from romantics and conservatives in terms of way of seeing. In this regard, it is worth pondering upon the Economic and Philosophical Manuscript of 1844, a compilation of fragments which played crucial role in the larger panorama of Marxian thesis. Usually, EPM, Economic and Philosophical Manuscript, is known to have offered an initiation with supposedly cryptic prose into the debate on the idea of alienation, among other thematics. But this idea is underpinned by a double register of seeing man. There is a double register of seeing a man that is involved, that is very crucial in this whole project of discussing some of those fundamental categories from Marxian sociology. On one hand, Marx can see the ideal situation in which man is species being, a particular phrase which comes, species being, an ideal situation in which man is species being, a whole entity organically linked with nature. A species being is a whole entity, whole, rounded entity organically linked with nature, though distinguishable due to the sensibility he acquires from society. As he says, and I quote, "Man lives on nature" means that nature is his body, with which he must remain in continuous interchange if he is not to die. Quote ends. And such a man is equipped with not only 5 sense organs, but perhaps more than that. Sensuality and spirituality also figure in the whole sensory design of this man, who can be in that ideal situation where he is a fulsome personality, organically linked with nature. It is such an immensely capable man that is endangered by the process of objectification, estrangement, and alienation. I am just using these key terms without caring to define each of them. I am trying to suggest that these are the key terms which he employs. These also acquire conceptual relevance. Why? Because they are very deep, very profound, and they have been developed out of constant engagement with variety of materials, and so he would say that this immensely capable man is endangered by the process of objectification, estrangement, and alienation. This adds another layer to the Marxian way of seeing, enabling to fathom the anomalies of industrial society. In this wake, man is regressing to the cave dwelling, but in an alienated form. Regressing to the cave dwelling and in an alienated form. This is a profound expression on the anomalies of industrial society, and it is causing men, both proletariat and bourgeoisie, both to suffer. They both suffer. About hard-working, sober, economical, prosaic men with ownership of private property, Marx notes, his enjoyment is only a secondary matter. It is recreation subordinated to production, and thus a calculated economic enjoyment, for he charges his pleasures as an expense of capital, and what he squanders must not be more than can be replaced with profit by the reduction of capital. While presenting his imagination of man and his world, Marx not only divulges his way of seeing, but also presents consistent critique of the approaches in political economy. Seeing man as a mere abstract category in the machinery of production, circulation and consumption, in between the mathematical calculation of profit and loss, is not what Marx ascribes. For him, man is far more than what figures in most of the mathematical calculations in the discussions on political economy. It assumes more clarity as far as Marxian way of seeing is concerned when one returns to the German ideology. This is where he emphatically positions himself in the realm of reality, as he notes, and I quote, "The premises from which we begin are not arbitrary ones, not dogmas, but real premises, from which abstraction can only be made in the imagination. They are the real individuals, their activity and the material conditions of their life, both those which they find already existing and those produced by their activity. These premises can thus be verified in a purely empirical way." What all are being dismissed? Arbitrary premises and dogmas. What is being restored and advocated? Reality and the intellectual exercise of abstracting from the real premises. This all leads to a Marxian scheme of empiricism, which is in negotiation with the predecessors, distinguishable, however, due to the preoccupation with the real, historical man and his activities. In so doing, Marx subverted Hegel. Marx reiterates it eloquently in the preface to the Capital, and I quote, "My dialectic method is not only different from the Hegelian, but its direct opposite. To Hegel, the life process of the human brain, that is, the process of thinking, which under the name of the idea he even transforms into an independent subject, is the demiurgos of the real world, and the real world is only the external phenomenon from the external phenomenal form of the idea. With me," which means with Marx, "with me, on the contrary, the ideal is nothing else than the material world reflected by human mind and translated into forms of thought." Close end. In this quote, a lot of things get clearer. There is an uncanny Marxian hermeneutic at the core of this empiricism that is succinctly expressed when Marx tries to highlight that individuals express their life. It is a typically Marxian hermeneutic that is expressed when Marx says, and I quote, "As individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with what they produce and with how they produce. Hence, what individuals are depends on the material condition of their production." Quote end. One can understand the kind of methodology emerges from Marxian body of thought. This is a material, contextual and social base on which Marx is proposing a qualitatively different sense of empiricism vis-a-vis historical materialism. Is a variety of methodological orientation, namely historical materialism, in which empiricism is important, but it is not the same empiricism which we have encountered in scientific epistemology, as it were. In the center of such an empirical scheme is the man with his real struggles and transformation. Following such empiricism, Marx unravels the various epochs in history that engendered corresponding sets of relations, technology, and forms of property, all coming under the scheme of division of labor. There is indeed a sense of positivism about it, as the Marxian analysis is geared to a positive reconstruction of the otherwise negative postulates of the predecessors, as well as transformative politics in the industrial society. In Marxian way of seeing, thus a clear sight of social structure emerges, which is continually evolving out of the life process of definite individuals. Marx persuades us to see the real individuals, conditions and processes steering clear of phantoms formed in the brains of men. Reminiscent of the Baconian idols of mind, these phantoms are sublimates of their material life process, which could be empirically verifiable and bound to material grounds. One can see that Baconian struggle against idols of mind is common in both Emile Durkheim sociology and in Marxian body of thought. Anyways, moving ahead, such ideologically colored empirical ideas, inclusive of morality, religion, metaphysics, ideology, and any form of consciousness, are only humbugs for Marx. So, therefore, he puts it very succinctly when he says, and I quote, "Consciousness can never be anything else than conscious being, and the being of men is their actual life process. If in all ideology men and their relations appear upside down as in a camera obscura, this phenomenon arises just as much from their historical life process as the inversion of objects on the retina does from their physical life process. It is not consciousness that determines life, but life that determines consciousness." These are some of the famous quotes from the body of thought Marx presents, which makes more sense if they are placed in this frame of discussion geared toward understanding Marxian methodology. As soon as these corrections are made in the scheme of empiricism and reality, rather than following camera obscura, history ceases to be a collection of dead facts. Otherwise, history is a collection of dead facts. Likewise, it also corrects the ideological humbug that idealists create by putting forth imagined activities of imagined subjects. Neither empty phrases of idealists nor the verifiable abstractions of empiricists can engender the history of material or real lives. It allows a seer to see that there is an interplay of man and circumstances, individual and collective, biography and history. Typically, it's been expressed typically by Marx saying that circumstances make men just as much as men make circumstances. Only speculative, idealistic, fantastic way of seeing allows perceiving man and his social world in binary opposition, akin to the opposition between nature and society that rationalists have created. Some of such ideas have been dominant, ruling ideas of the epoch, belonging to the ruling intellectual force that controls means and relations of production. Such ideas have masqueraded as eternal law, only to be tossed away in the wake of understanding arising from the scheme of historical materialism that enables us to see the things as they are and seek to transform them. This is not merely a political agenda, it is an epistemological proposition too, for, to reiterate, where speculation ends in real life, their real positive science begins. Sorry. And thus, the Marxian way of seeing, and if one can say being sociological, summons not only a different scheme of empiricist history, positivistic scientific formulations, but also a struggle to change, typically expressed in what is famously known as Thesis 11 on Feuerbach. And what is Thesis 11 on Feuerbach by Marx? And this is almost like the bottom line of motivation for Marxian methodology. And what is that Thesis 11? The bottom line for motivation? It is, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Cut. If Marx has tried to fight against the phantom of mind by creating yet another variety of empiricism vis-a-vis historical materialism, it is with Max Weber that we begin to return to the philosophical trouble which Immanuel Kant had tried resolving. Known to be a neo-Kantian in inclination, Max Weber emphasized that an empirical discipline scientifically explaining the world in terms of what ought to be is difficult. One cannot validate value judgment through scientific analysis. However, it does not mean the shift of understanding human behavior from the domain of science altogether. Weber grapples with such puzzles, and because of that he becomes distinguishable, and this distinction is established in his masterpiece, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which originally appeared as two long articles in 1904 and 1905. As it is familiar, these essays emphasize the role played by various denominations of Christianity in shaping up the spirit behind the development of capitalism. The climax of this development was brought about by Calvinism, which, unlike the other variants such as Lutheranism and Catholicism, paved the way for practices in the midst of disenchantment of the world. Most important among others is the idea of calling that acquires finitude in Weber's analysis. In the spirit as well as in his methodological ruminations that spells out his way of seeing, we begin to notice that there is a cold clinical way of seeing through, as popular Weberian phrase reads, the iron cage of rationality. Most appropriate expression of it is in Weber's passionate defense for value neutrality in empirical science that solicits from teachers as well as students, seekers and seers of knowledge, an extraordinary performance. Value neutrality is the intrinsically simple demand, in Max Weber's words, it is intrinsically simple demand that the investigator and teacher should keep unconditionally separate the establishment of empirical facts, including the value oriented conduct of the empirical individual whom he is investigating, and his own practical evaluations, that is, his evaluations of these facts as satisfactory or unsatisfactory, including among these facts evaluations made by the empirical persons who are the objects of investigation. The calling of science, or as elsewhere Weber puts it, science as a vocation characterized by value neutrality, engulfs both teachers transacting knowledge in the lecture hall as well as researchers who seek to know through investigations. Weber uses evaluative phrases such as intellectual honesty and intellectual integrity to describe the pitfalls of the demagogue, such as demagogue who are teachers, and those teachers add personal touch to scientific deliberation, and therefore they are called demagogues by Max Weber. Taking a dig at such passionate teachers, Weber calls them officially accredited prophets who deliver personally tinted professorial type of prophecy in the name of science. This is too harsh, we can understand that, but this is how he goes on. He says, the calm of rigor, matter of factness and sobriety of lecture declines with definite pedagogical losses when the substance and manner of public discussion are introduced in the style of the press. The vocation of science as well as teaching does not permit the personality cult that follows from the professorial prophecies of officially privileged prophets. The vocation requires the separation of personal and factual, ethical and scientific, public speaking and pedagogy. This applies to students as well as teachers who shall fulfill their tasks in workmanlike fashion, recognize facts even though they may be personally discomforting, and repress impulse, personal taste and sentiments in the vocation. This is like Weberian way of reminding some of the philosophical lessons that emerged from scientific epistemology. While subscribing to the imperative of value neutrality, one ought to be cautioned, as Weber suggests, that it is not about denying value judgment, and this is neo-Kantian orientation of Weber. This is not about denying value judgment in the public, political and cultural spheres. The same teacher or scientist who maintain value neutrality in lectures and science can express judgments in the non-academic pursuits. And likewise, it is misnomer that one can be value neutral just by weighing the various evaluations like a statesman to make a compromise among them. One cannot be scientific just by showing the self-evident value judgment and thereby taking it for granted. The specific function of science, Weber suggests, is to ask questions about these things which convention makes self-evident. A so-called realistic analysis of the astronomical conceptions of the Chinese does not necessarily demonstrate the correctness of the Chinese astronomy. Of course, it has Weberian prejudices inherent in this kind of suggestions. One can recall a similar position Weber took in the Spirit book, which persuaded us to see lack of rationality in scientific as much as in economic pursuits in the Asian thought systems. The idea of calling and subsequently vocation has to be seen in this context. It is not calling with traditionalist or Lutheran dependence on divinity that is invoked when vocation of science becomes a source of Weberian way of seeing. Instead, it is a variety that is shorn off all traditionalist outlook and has acquired sheer this worldliness of here and now, of performing as if there were no tomorrow. As a central dogma of all Protestant dominations, originally developed by Luther, it meant the only way of living acceptable to God was not to surpass worldly morality in monastic asceticism, but solely through the fulfillment of the obligations imposed upon the individual by his position in the world. Calvinism diminished the irrational impulses of the idea of calling by enforcing a religious worldview distinguishable from the Orthodox Catholicism. In this regard, this is important to recall what some of the readers of Max Weber have suggested. C. Wright Mills and Goethe uphold the view that Weber seeks to deliver double responses to two significant names, one Marx and other Nietzsche. Both are equally significant in providing content to the Weberian way of seeing in sociology. With Marx, Weber shares the sociological approach to ideas. They are powerless in history unless they are fused with material interests. And with Nietzsche, he is deeply concerned with the importance of ideas for psychic reactions. Yet, in contrast to both Nietzsche and Marx, Weber refused to conceive of ideas as being mere reflections of psychic or social interests. Weber is also eager to state possible tensions between ideas and interests, between one sphere and another, or between internal states or external demands. This explains the reasons why Weber is keen to adopt a Robinson Crusoe approach, so to say. Robinson Crusoe approach to social man and his mindful adoption of the Friedrich Schiller's phrase, the disenchantment of the world. And if the human world is such, why should the science, the proponents of science, including teachers, students, seekers of knowledge, should not be equally heartless in approach? The heartlessness in this way of seeing in Weberian methodology is due to the ideas that render the world cold. Reminiscent of the linear sense of progress of the Enlightenment, it necessitates a value neutral science. Having stated what is value neutrality in the calling of science and what is not, Weber delves a little more in the domain of ethical value judgments, revisiting Kant's critique. He admits that discussion of evaluation has a utility insofar as it aids in understanding explanation. However, understanding all does not mean pardoning all, excusing all. Understanding all does not mean accepting all. A rather complex track, in fact more complex than Kant, leads Weber to conclude that value discussions, when correctly conducted, can be extremely valuable for empirical research in the sense that it provides it with problems for investigation. The problem of understanding is an important problem in Weber's sociology, since man understands intentions through introspection, and hence sociologists shall get to understand men's intentions, motivated actions. To do so, types of actions such as rational, affective and traditionalist is a conducive anchorage, and likewise the basic types of structures such as society, association and community could be heuristically significant. This is all toward the making of Weber's interpretative sociology, which considers the individual and his action as the basic unit, as its atom, if the disputable comparison for once may be permitted. In this approach, the individual is also the upper limit and the sole courier of meaningful conduct. This is what brings Weber to discuss another aspect of his methodology. It is about the complex domain of meanings fraught with value discussions that happens to be the key target in Weber's interpretative sociology. Meanings arise in a concrete situation referring to a particular actor, or average or approximate meaning attributable to a given plurality of actors, or the theoretically conceived pure type of subjective meaning attributed to the hypothetical actor or actors in a given type of action. None of these need be an objectively correct meaning that shall be taken for granted by empirical sciences such as sociology and history. The important rider in this is that all subjective meanings may not be worth pondering. The subjective meaning arising from mystical experiences cannot be adequately communicated. For example, only those which are located in experience and can be recalled and reproduced shall be given further attention. Like in scientific observation, there are usual social practices of interpreting meanings, seeking to verify, clarify and comprehend. To understand a meaning with certainty, there are certain bases, such as rational, which means direct observational rational understanding of logico-mathematical kind, or emotionally empathetic. In emotionally empathic, which would mean explanatory understanding of artistic appreciation, some kind of empathy based understanding. The highest degree of rational understanding with verifiable certainty is possible when the meanings have logical or mathematical propositions, such as 2 into 2 is equal to 4, or the Pythagorean theorem, or when a person enacts with clear means and ends as per a situation. These are rationally purposeful actions. Understanding such meanings, motivations, cause and effect entail direct observation. Lower degree of understanding based on empathy of meanings pertaining to actions with many ends and values and lacks in certainty This is when one cannot be sure of one clear motive behind an action, that irrational meanings can emerge with emotional appeals, but certainly not intellectual clarity about certainty. One can develop an explanatory understanding of the irrational meanings, as Weber speaks through the following examples. Thus, and I quote, "Thus we understand the chopping of wood or aiming of a gun in terms of motive, in addition to direct observation, if we know that the wood chopper is working for a wage or is chopping a supply of firewood for his own use, or possibly is doing it for recreation," so and so forth. Max Weber has therefore enhanced the methodological discussion by bringing in a different kind of hermeneutic turn with his interpretative sociology. This is where we would briefly stop our discussion on Trinity in classical sociology, and we have already understood as to how they have responded to the Enlightenment fundamentals and what kind of positivism they have engaged with. Thank you.